Why does America seem to be a special place? What makes it so great? What made it so powerful? Find the answers to that and more on today's podcast. So let's talk about America today. That's what we're going to focus on. A very important topic because I think it really frames a discussion about where we are and what's going on. So first, a little bit about myself, real quick. I'm actually an immigrant into this country. I moved here about 50 years ago. But before I moved here, I lived in two places. I lived in Europe and I lived in Israel. And then I came here. And it was a traumatic event for me to move here. And one of the things I've done in my life is I've always kept thinking about the differences of what I experienced in those other places and then what I experienced here in the U.S. And so a lot of the material in this video is going to come from that, which I think is interesting. So first of all, what is America? America, we're hearing a lot of bad things about America, right? But let me tell you something. America is amazing. America is great. And we're going to talk about what makes it so great. This is not going to be just, rah-rah American flag waving hyperbole, although there's a place for that and there's a good reason to be patriotic, to be honest with you. But America really and truly is an amazing place, and I'm going to tell you why. So first of all, I've been here for about 50 years, and I've been in South Florida. And South Florida has experienced multiple waves of immigration from Latin America and other places as well, but mostly from Latin America. And so what we see, what I've seen my whole life is this. The U.S. is really the world's escape valve. Whenever something bad happens in other countries, you get a massive wave of immigrants coming here. And you got to wonder, doesn't anything bad ever happen in the U.S.? Why is it that bad things always happen in these other countries and everybody's got to run off and move, yet that never happens in the U.S.? Doesn't happen much in Europe either, but it happens even less in the U.S. So that was the first thing that I thought about as a kid is why is everybody coming here? Right? What's wrong with their countries? What did they have to, why couldn't they stay? I knew from experience, being an immigrant is one of the hardest things you can do in life, period. Okay? You leave everything behind, especially in those days, right? Now we have the internet, you can actually go from one country to another and you can still get news from your old country. Okay, back in the 70s, you couldn't do this. Once you left your country, you left for good. You wouldn't even hear news. You would disconnect from family. It was very difficult. So why do people do this? That was one of my first questions. And so we saw multiple waves. For example, the first one was the Cubans in 1979, the Mariel boat lift. If you saw the movie Scarface with Al Pacino, that tells the story of that era. Many other countries, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Colombians, Argentinians, Brazilians, some of these countries had multiple waves of immigration. Some of them had problems with hyperinflation, some had communist takeovers, some had just unbearable violence, like drug-related violence, like some of the things that happened in Colombia, in multiple kind of phases. And so you just had millions and millions of people moving here. Yet that doesn't happen here in the U.S. That's kind of interesting. Why does it happen there and not here? So really, what's the difference, right? And of course, we've seen many waves of immigration. This is before, into the U.S. there were a lot of waves from Europe, right? You had the famous waves of the Italians. If you saw the movie The Godfather, you saw that kind of story. You had the Irish moving here. You had Polish. There's a lot of different waves of immigrants from Europe that happened, earlier on. Then, of course, you've got people from Africa. You have also many big waves from Asia moving in here. So the U.S. appears to be the world's escape valve, and there's a reason for that. Despite all the bad propaganda that we've heard, all the bad history that we've been taught, that our kids have been taught in schools, despite all of that, okay, people still come here. So that should tell you something. And not only do they come here, but there are stories, right? And so being here for so many years, I've heard, many interesting stories of people who risk everything to come here. There was a story from Cuba. There was a guy who was a professional windsurfer. He got on his windsurfing board and he windsurfed for 2.5 days to get to the keys from Cuba. I mean, who does this? Really? I mean, what would make you as an American get on a windsurfing board and go to Cuba? Right? I mean, there's nothing in the world that would make us do that. We think, right? The water is full of sharks. I mean, who would even consider something like this? It's ridiculous. And yet it happens. Which really, it should put a bug in your head as to say, what was going on in Cuba that made this guy come over here on a windsurfing board? Right? And of course there's, political persecution. There's, his life was probably in danger, God knows what. So that was one interesting story. A second one, we've also heard many stories, staying on Cuba for a moment, of the people who came over on rafts. Many of them drowned because they got on whatever raft, whatever, rinky-dink vessel they thought could take them there, and they just risked their lives, and many of them lost their lives. So you got to consider that. These are people. Okay, they're human beings. They're not stupid. There's reasons why they did this. I heard another interesting story. This one was from kind of Eastern Europe, Russia, that region, of a guy who wanted to leave, and he was in a port city, and he saw an American ship that it wasn't exactly docked. It was kind of like in the middle of the harbor. You couldn't get to it. Like, you couldn't jump on the ship from the harbor. It was kind of in the middle. And one night he noticed that there was a crane, one of these huge cranes, that had been left there. And the crane had its arm sticking out over the harbor, and the cable was dangling over that ship. So it gave him an idea. He climbed the entire crane, and then he went down the cable, and he got onto the ship, hid himself in the ship somewhere. And when the ship was out in international waters, he came out and he said, whatever, I'm looking for asylum. This is what he did to get out. Okay? How many of us would do something like that? You think about this. You think America's bad? You think other countries are better? How many Americans do you hear about climbing a crane? To jump on a Russian ship and go over to... I mean, you just don't hear about these things. And so this should give us some pause. In spite of all the nonsense we're hearing about how bad America is, this should give us some pause as to what's really going on. So let's talk about why they do it. And really what makes America great. And it's not what you think. We talk about our democracy. Well, we have elections, and we have a democracy, and we have a president. So what? Okay? Many countries have democracies. Many countries have elections. It's got nothing to do with that. That's all just surface level nonsense. Here's what's really happening that really counts under the cover. America's a very young country. It's 250 years old. But before that, the important thing was that there was no civilization here. When the Pilgrims came here, all they found was some native, some Indians, Native Americans. But they were basically, it was a much older society. They were basically hunter-gatherers, nomads that would just run around. There was nothing built here, right? There were no big structures, no roads, no infrastructure, nothing like that was built. And so they came to a virgin country. And that's the key right there. If you think about how many countries in the world have been virgin countries, there aren't any, right? Europe hasn't been virgin for thousands of years. The Far East, probably even longer. So there are many countries that were formed after the Soviet Union fell, for example, but all they did was redraw borders on a map. The people stayed, the infrastructure was already there, it stayed. It may have been a little better, may have been a little worse, but it was already established. America was not established. So when Americans came here, they had to do something that no other country had to do, which is build up a country from nothing. Because of this, the culture that came out was a meritocracy, right? We don't care who you are. You're 2 feet, land on the United States. Listen, we got work to do. We got roads to build. We got train tracks to lay. We got skyscrapers to build. We got to set up a food supply, water supply, everything. We got stuff to do. Can you do some work? Okay, here's a garden hoe. Go do some work, right? Here's a sledgehammer. Go lay some tracks, right? We don't care who you are. We don't care who your parents are. We don't care what your last name is. We don't care about any of that. You were poor in your home country? Great, wonderful. Here's a sledgehammer. Go get to work, okay? That was incredibly different from everywhere else. You go to places like Europe, for example. Europe, which is actually quite advanced compared to the rest of the world, right? But you go to Europe and everything's already been built, right? Dynasties are already made. People, mafias, are controlling everything, right? There's been enough time for those civilizations to where a few people can wrest control from everybody else. And then you have this little mafia on top. They control pretty much almost all the wealth. They give whatever they want to give to the rest of the country. In Europe, you have a lot of government benefits and so on and so forth, so people can kind of live there and it's still relatively good. But in many other places, like, you think of places like Africa or the Far East, some of these like really repressive regimes, or Cuba even, life is impossible, right? They will not let you live. And it's not the environment that's a problem, it's other humans. So you didn't have that in the US. There were no controlling mafias. Now, 250 years later, we're starting to get there, right? You now have your Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and Kennedys and the Bushes and whatever. You start to get these dynasties to form, but they're still not fully formed here to where they control the entire country. So for example, I've been to Mexico several times, and Mexico, I remember back like 20, 30 years ago, 38 families, 38 controlled like 90% of the wealth in Mexico. Okay, you don't see that in the US, right? The US is too big. There's probably millions of millionaires here. And so it's not controllable. The US is not controllable by any single organization. If you're in Mexico and you're like the big head honcho in Mexico, you can get the 38 families in a room and get them to agree to something, because it's only 38 families, right? So it's in the end, it's like 40 people, right? 40 heads of the families or whatever. It's doable. Here, it's not doable. You don't even know who these people are, first of all. There's millions of them. I mean, you can't do it. So countries, as they mature and get older, get controlled by mafias, but we're not there yet. And we need to be very careful that it stays that way. Because if it doesn't, I promise you, with as rich as America is and as big as it is and whatever, once the mafia controls this place, it will become like the other countries. And of course, that's what they're after, if you really look at politics, but we'll get into that in another video. But this is what really makes America different. This is what lights a fire under every immigrant and says, I want to go there, because there I can do something. All I have to do there is work, and I can actually live. Here in my old country, I belong to a poor family. We have no connections. Everybody knows we're poor. The minute they see my last name, they know who I am. That's it. I'm done. I'm toast. So this is what really makes America great. So the second thing is that you have, okay, so we came here, we have a virgin country that we're setting up. What system are you going to use, right? That's the second question, right? We could have gone for something like communism or socialism, but we didn't. Instead, the people that came here, the founding fathers, thankfully, they had come from Europe. So they didn't come from some, backwater place that they didn't know what civilization was. They came from Europe. They saw the civilizations in Europe. They saw the problems that they had. And they came here and they designed a system that was going to get around all those problems. And it was a system that was very practical. It had to be, because again, we had a country to build. And so what they put in place here was a meritocracy, and they put a system of government that was not very efficient on purpose, so that the government could not take too much power over people's lives. Okay? So that was the second thing. Because you might say, oh, well, the Soviet Union was only built in the 20th century, and it's kind of similar to America, right? It's a huge land, even bigger than the U.S. Lots of the land is undeveloped. So how come they weren't successful? Well, look at the system they chose. They went after the intellectuals like Marx and Engels, who came up with communism. And if you see what they did, if you compare the foundations of communism to the American system was founded on a lot of positive ideas, right? We have to build a country. This is what works. Let's incentivize people. Let's reward people. Let's give them freedom. Let them do whatever they want, whatever they're good at, right? Just let things take off organically. It was a very positive-minded philosophy. Communism was born out of the class struggle. From the get-go, they were saying that rich people were evil and they're hoarding everything and we got to take it away from them. And so it was a way to sort of balance out the books, right? Create what people today call social justice, okay? But of course, it ended up being a very cynical system because all they did was consolidate the wealth into an even smaller mafia than was there before. Now you just had the party, and in the Communist Party they controlled all the wealth, and everybody else, was out of luck. So that was the second thing that happened in the U.S. is that thankfully we had founding fathers who picked a really good foundation. And here something else very important needs to be mentioned. In spite of the fact that there was separation of church and state, the founding fathers had a very religious background. In those days, religion was very strong, and it's not the religion that's important, but it's the morality and the laws from the Bible that are important. Because the laws from the Bible are actually very advanced and very constructive if you just take them at face value, right? Don't go chasing after what organized religion did with them. That's something else. But they took a lot of the ideas from the Bible. And the ideas in the Bible, they work. If you look at the Ten Commandments, you want to set up a society? Follow the Ten Commandments. If you have a group of people who follow the Ten Commandments, that's a great neighborhood. Think about it for a moment. There's no killing, there's no stealing, no one's lying, right? Being a false witness. Their kids respect their parents. No one is even coveting, other people's stuff, whatever. I mean, it's a set of laws that you put it in place and just watch everything blossom. So that was a foundation that they put into the United States. And that was a second really important thing that makes America great, is that it was more of a nation. We say a lot, a nation based on laws, right? It's not based on power. It's not based on a mafia. It's based on laws. And the laws came from originally the Bible, and then from the minds of the founding fathers based on what they had seen in Europe. So it was a really great 1-2 punch that has created this country and made it what it is today. Now, there's a lot of negativity that I've seen in the last few decades that's been pushed on us. Talking about how bad America is, how evil it is, how we had slaves and we had this and we had that. So I'm going to say this, right? And because I've come from other places and I've seen the difference with my own 2 eyes, apart from the things I've read and everything, I've actually seen this with my own 2 eyes. I'm not going to get taken in by this nonsense. They are, to put it mildly, they are grossly exaggerating, or maybe not exaggerating, but they're over-focusing on the negative things, and they don't talk about the positive things. Listen, if you take any place and you only focus on the negative, the place is going to sound horrible. And that's what they've done to the United States. So, for example, they talk about slavery. But do you know that slavery still exists in many parts of the world? Yeah, we had slavery, but we actually got rid of slavery, right? America had a system that would renew itself, and it actually got to the point where we ended up fighting a whole civil war over slavery. And then we ended slavery. Okay, so is America perfect? No. But you have to compare it to the other countries. So, really, these people that badmouth the U.S. or that repeat the nonsense that they hear, oftentimes you find that they've either never left the U.S., they've never seen any other country, or if they have, they just went there on vacation. And they came back thinking, wow, that place was wonderful. It was so much more relaxing than the U.S. Yeah, because you were on vacation. Okay? Now go try to live there. Go try to make a living. Go see how difficult it is. And I've actually done some work in Europe. And let me tell you something. It Much, much more difficult to get anything done in Europe. Europe is a much older place. It moves at a slower pace. There's a certain there's a positive aspect to that. It can be more relaxing, but again, it's more like, you can almost call them like retired countries, right? It's like the whole country's kind of like in a retirement phase. They don't focus so much on work, they focus on other things. But this causes a lot of problems, right? On the day-to-day activities, you want to get things done, it's a problem. We were recently in Italy, for example. We went on one of these museum tours, and the guide was a funny guy, and he said, Italy's beautiful, and he said, the art, the architecture, wow, it's awesome. And he's like, but try to get something done here. My God, and you'll wonder why you still live here. It's like, try to get your plumbing fixed. Try to get, and that's how it is. So a lot of these people that start bad-mouthing the U.S., they don't know what they're talking about. And many times they are being informed, so to speak, if you can call it that, by a news establishment that's not really news. It's all agenda-driven. So, these people that talk, have they actually studied history? Have they read any history books? Have they lived abroad? No, they're all just listening to propaganda and repeating it, right? And so I'm going to say this. I have lived abroad in 3 other countries other than the U.S., okay? I've also been fortunate enough, thank God, to travel to about 30 other countries, okay? So I'm just going to give a little bit of a list of the things I have seen, okay? Some of the things that go on. So here's the list. First, with the real bad stuff. You have slavery, you have sex trafficking. I've actually seen this. My own 2 eyes. Okay? Real genocides. Not the one they're accusing Israel of, right? The only genocide I've ever seen where the population of the people being killed actually is still going up. What is that? I'm talking about real genocides. You talk about, for example, what happened in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, where they killed millions of the older generation, basically. They wiped them out. That's a genocide. And that stuff still happens. That doesn't happen here in the U.S. It doesn't happen anywhere in the West. Yeah, there's violence. Sure, there's racism. Yes, there is. But it's on a much smaller scale. You don't see genocides. Okay? Infant mortality. Okay? I mean, you see a lot more of that in some of these other countries. The mutilation of women. Okay? You don't see that here. Multi-generational vendettas. Okay? In the U.S., we have the legend of the Hatfields and the McCoys. That's the closest thing we have. But that was from a long time ago. Maybe it still exists, but it's on a very small scale. You look at something like Sicily, for example. Okay? And you have these vendettas. You see that in the movie The Godfather, right? But you have things like this. In the Middle East, of course, this is paramount, which is why they never get out of that state of war that they're in. That's one of the reasons anyway. You have honor killings, right? You have polygamy. You have a surveillance state, right? In China, they have something called a social credit score. If you say certain things, if you don't behave a certain way, you actually get penalized. You can't go to certain schools. You can't get certain jobs. It's all automated, right? Pretty scary. Okay? There are monarchs in the world that own entire countries. Own them. With all the people in them. They own the people. Okay? This still exists. Okay? Massive economic instability and political instability. Right? You see these coup d'etat, these government overthrows and things like that. Or you see massive inflation, hyperinflation, which makes living impossible. You don't see that in the U.S. Never had that here. What about obligatory military service? You have to serve in the military. We don't have that here. What about capital controls? If you leave the U.S., you want to take your money with you, you can. You just have to report that you're taking a certain amount of money. In many places, you cannot leave with your money. You have to leave it there. Okay? We went through this. Again, my family went through this, us personally. Okay, so this is real. Sometimes you're not allowed to leave certain countries. They'll just block you from leaving. You can't leave. That's it. This happens in Cuba, for example. Okay? Lack of doctors. lack of medicine or medical supplies. A lot of people talk about medicine in Cuba. Oh, it's great, it's free medicine. Let me tell you about Cuba, okay? My mother was from Cuba. I have a cousin who came from Cuba, okay? And when he came here, you know why he was allowed to leave? Because a daughter was born to him that had diabetes. And there was no insulin in Cuba. So they allowed him to leave because they recognized, yeah, she can't get insulin here, she's going to die. This is what happens in Cuba, folks. Okay, not the propaganda nonsense or all that bullshit that the leftists like to talk about. Okay? You go to the hospital in Cuba, you got to bring your own sheets. There's no medicine in the hospitals. Okay? Again, I'm being told this by people who are actually there, traveling back and forth. Okay? What other things do you see? Sudden mass violence. You'll have sudden riots and it'll just erupt in some of these countries and hundreds, thousands of people will get killed. You know? What about no sewage pipes? Right? Imagine going to a place where they have open air sewers. You see water flowing down the street and it's the black water from the bathrooms and such. Okay? Okay? Those are the really big bad things. Now, what are some of the little things? Right? When you go to the third world, it's a very different culture. You have this distinct feeling that it's every man for himself and it's all of us against the government. A lot of Americans complain, for example, that immigrants come here and they want to scam the system. You know why? Because the system in their home country was so heinous that the only way you could survive was by scamming the system. So a whole culture has been built on scamming the system. They don't even realize they're doing it. They just do it out of reflex. It's been going on for so long. So they come here to the U.S. and what are they going to do? Well, they're going to do what they know. They know the U.S. is wonderful, but they don't really understand how. You don't really understand how until you lived here for many years. So they come here and they just keep doing the same thing because that's all they know. Right? So if somebody asked me to define what's the difference between like the first world and the third world, in the first world people help each other, and in the third world people screw each other. That's it in one sentence. Okay? What else do you see? You see a lot of apathy. People know things are not going to get better, so they just don't care. Because if they did, they'd go crazy. So they just do whatever. And you see some very weird behavior. Like, for example, in the middle of a war, when like half a city's burning, you might see the other half of the city throwing parties. Because again, it's like, yeah, half the city's burning. It's always burning. There's always something going on. If we wait for everything to be okay, to be happy, we're never going to be happy. And so you see weird things like this going on. You see a lack of living space. Okay? Very, very small little apartments and everybody's crowded on top of each other. You see a lack of water pressure. Okay? You turn on a faucet and a little dribble of water comes out and that's all you get. How about that? Okay? You see a lot of irrationality. When you talk to people, people know, these people, they're not living in a good state. They're not living in a good state of affairs. So a lot of them develop these fantasies or they vent. They're constantly venting and they say things that are irrational. So you speak to them about something like politics and they just talk nonsense. They don't know what they're talking about. And a lot of them will just, if they ever start rioting, they just go into full anarchy mode because they don't even know what they want. They don't know how to make things better. They know they can't make things better even if they knew how. And so you see this, right? And you don't see this in the U.S. You talk to people, you see different opinions, but by and large, there's a practicality behind their opinions. You see a lot of brownouts. Now, we're seeing a lot of these in the U.S. now, especially in California, because there's not enough electricity production. And so you got to start having like these rolling blackouts or brownouts, as I like to call them. They're a lot more prevalent overseas. You see a lot of disorganization, chaos, and ridiculous bureaucracy. Like just ridiculous to the point where you can't even get things done. Or how about this one? How about if you had to wait for hours or sometimes days just to pay a bill? To pay an electric bill. You think every place pays their bills online? No, you have to go to an office and you got to sit out there in the sun, huge long lines waiting so you can pay a bill so they don't turn off your electricity. Okay? How about that? Okay, so those are just some of the things I've seen. And if you think America's bad, just, go through this list a little bit and, you kind of start to realize where we're all at. And so, lastly, we're going to talk about American capitalism, because obviously this is one of the things that makes America great. And American capitalism, folks, it just works, okay? Other countries like Cuba, they have this communism, and then they make excuses and they say, yeah, we're poor because the American embargo. They're always saying that down there. But listen, if your system was so great, why do you need the Americans? Why does it matter that the Americans embargoed you, right? We don't suffer because any country embargoes us, right? We make our own stuff because we have a system that perpetuates itself, right? It's organic growth from within. That's the only real system that works. If you're depending on something from the outside, you don't have a good system. So, and we see again so many stories of immigrants who came over here and, they had nothing. They came over here with nothing, and it was, the famous American rags to riches story, right? You see so many Cubans in Miami. They came here with nothing, and now many of them are millionaires. Look at Steve Jobs, Larry Ellison, Walt Disney, Oprah Winfrey, Abraham Lincoln, Howard Hughes, Andrew Carnegie. The list is endless, right? You don't see this in other places, folks. In other places, you have these families that have been wealthy for hundreds of years, literally centuries. And again, ruling mafias that just grab onto power and never let go, right? And so things slow down in those systems. There's no incentive. Why are you going to work your tail off if all you're ever going to get is a salary? Doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to be recognized because they don't want you rising up to the top. There's that glass ceiling. So why are you going to be incentivized? You're not. You're just going to go work. You're going to do the minimum to keep your job, and that's it. So in America, you come and you start doing things, you actually might become a millionaire or more. And look at all the innovations that have come out of the United States. Just a few, to name a few. Internet, lasers, GPS, personal computers, mobile phones, moving pictures, meaning the cinema, sewing machines, steamboats, airplanes, light bulbs, traffic lights. These all came out in the U.S. Okay, why is that? Because we're working here. Why are we working? Because there's incentive. Because if you work, you may actually get rich and your whole life will change. So because of all this, America is energetic. It's full of energy. You don't see this in other countries. Other countries are relaxed. Things are stable. Yeah, people are poor. They're more or less making it, but, there's no way they can't climb that ladder. Here you can. So that's it. I mean, today we talked about all the different aspects of why America's great. And I wanted to talk about this first because now in the next episode, we're going to talk about what happened to the United States, why it started to go down, and why we find ourselves in this precarious position. So once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.